Well, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today, hosted by the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, IESBA, on the subject of key topics in the IESSA. My name is Geoff Kwan, and I'm a director at IESBA, and I will be the moderator of this webinar. I was also fortunate enough to be part of the IESBA Sustainability project for the last 2 years. So, of course, we believe very strongly in the importance of these new sustainability standards. So, I'm really pleased to see that we have a good number of participants today from all over the world. So if I can turn to the presenters page, and let me first introduce our presenters to everyone. Today we have Szilvia Sramko and Leal, who were both members of the IESBA's sustainability project and participating in developing the IESBA's new standards on sustainability reporting and assurance. Szilvia is a principal at IESBA since 2018, and she's currently involved in the IESBA Sustainability Project with a particular focus on the International Independent Standards for Sustainability Assurance. She was also the staff lead for the assurance workstream in our Sustainability Task Force the last 2 years. And Szilvia is also involved currently in the rollout of IESBA Sustainability Standards. Next, we have Laura, who is also a principal at IESBA since 2022. She is currently involved in IESBA's sustainability project with a particular focus on the ethics standards for sustainability assurance. And Laura was the staff lead for the ethics workstream within the Sustainability Task Force for the last 2 years. Laura is also a member of IESBA's new standard setting project on firm culture and governance. So welcome, Szilvia and Laura, and thank you for joining us today. Today's our presenter will provide first a background to IESBA's International Ethics Standards for Sustainability Assurance, or the IESSA, which is inserted as part of a new Part 5 of the code within our IESBA code. And also, they will also give you an overview of the key topics in the IESSA. And this webinar is the second event in a series of webinars on IESBA sustainability work. So there are a series of 3 different webinars. Yesterday's webinar, we covered IESBA's mission regarding sustainability reporting and assurance, as well as an overview of the sustainability reporting related revisions to the IESBA code. There is, of course, another webinar tomorrow that will go into a deep dive on the international independent standards in the IESA. If you have not already registered for this webinar tomorrow, I would strongly encourage you to do that because Szilvia and another board member will go into more the details of the IIS within IESA. And if you've missed out yesterday's webinar, that session will be posted, uploaded to our website towards the end of the week, along with the presentation. So today's session, as I mentioned, the agenda will cover the background to the IESA, the key characteristics and scope of IESA, as well as key topics on ethics and independence. After the presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. So before I pass to Szilvia and Laura, I would just like to walk through with you some basic house rules. If you do have questions throughout the session, I would encourage you to submit them in the Q&A function in your Zoom control panel towards the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time during the session, of course. And Szilvia and Laura will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation, when we have approximately 1 hour for the full presentation today, of course. And please note our webinar events and all the different webinars are being recorded, and they will all be posted on the IESBA website, along with the slides that we use for each of the presentations. So without further ado, I will now turn to Laura to start the presentation. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Geoff. So one of the principles that is guiding the IESBA's activities is that ethics is a means to an end, to contribute and to rebuild trust and confidence in businesses and in markets, and to support well-functioning economies and societies. And so what does this mean for sustainability? This means fostering the right behaviors and the right actions from those who are preparing information and also from those who are providing assurance on it, so that the users of the information can make informed investment decisions. And the truth is, we have seen increasing demand in the past few years for sustainability information to support capital allocation by investors and also by other stakeholders. And so there has been a pressing public interest to ensure that such information is trustworthy, it's comparable, and it's therefore capable of being subject to assurance. We have observed also rapid regulatory and standard-setting developments in the sustainability reporting space over recent years. For instance, with the development of global and regional sustainability reporting frameworks, such as the IFRS International Sustainability Standard Board standards, and also the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. But it is IESBA's conviction that the sustainability standards infrastructure will not be complete or operable or even effective without a robust complement of ethics and independent standards that underpin the reporting and the assurance frameworks. So looking at that cube on the left hand of the slide, we see that ethics is actually the framework that wraps the other two. The IESBA standards ensure that the application of the reporting and the assurance standards is not hindered by biases or by pressure or by conflicts of interests or even other ethical issues. So moving on to the next slide, please. We can look at the timeline of this journey. Let's see where it started. Let's see where it's ended. So the IESBA Sustainability Project commenced in December 2022 to develop, on the one hand, revisions to the code to address the ethics issues that might arise in sustainability reporting, and then on the other hand, also to develop ethics and independent standards for use and implementation by all sustainability assurance practitioners. The IESBA project was informed by wide outreach, and when I say wide, I mean in terms of geography, but also in terms of type of stakeholders. And this outreach included a series of global roundtables in 2023. The IESBA project was also complemented by another project from the IESBA, which is the use of experts, because due to the wide-ranging areas that are covered by sustainability and the detailed technical knowledge that is necessary in each of those areas, the truth is assurance practitioners may often need to involve external experts in those fields. The IESBA project also benefited from input from a reference group that was composed of non-accountants who had expertise and experience in sustainability reporting and assurance. There was also a very close coordination with the IESB's Sustainability Project, which developed a new overarching standard for sustainability assurance. There was full dedication and responsiveness of both IESBA and the IESB to calls from stakeholders and also from the Public Interest Oversight Board, the PIOB, for robust coordination to ensure the operability of both board standards. And this is visible in areas of, for example, common definitions in both standards, or the approach to group sustainability assurance engagements, the provisions on using the work of another practitioner, and also the effective date of both the IESBA and the IESB standards. And finally, the Public Interest Oversight Board, the PIOB, certified the IESBA sustainability standards in January 2025. So a month ago, more or less. At the same time, the IOSCO also issued a letter of support and called on its members to apply or otherwise be informed by the IESSA when considering ethics and independence requirements. So on the next slide, we can see that the IESBA's Ethics and Independence Standards for Sustainability Assurance, which we call the IESSA, they are housed in a new Part 5 of the IESBA Code of Ethics. And while Parts 1 to 4 of the IESBA Code apply to professional accountants, the IESSA was developed to be used by all those who are providing sustainability assurance, regardless of their professional background. So they can be accountants or they can be other professionals. And therefore, the development of a new and separate part of the code that contains specifically the ethics and the independent standards that apply to sustainability assurance seemed the best option in terms of providing a ready-made, tailored, fit-for-purpose framework that sustainability assurance practitioners can use. And I will now hand it over to Szilvia.
Thank you, Laura. So Laura has presented us the background of the IESSA. But what are the key characteristics of the IESSA? First of all, the standards are equivalent to the ethics and independent standards for audit engagement. Recognizing the public interest in sustainability, the IESBA holds to the premise that sustainability assurance engagement on sustainability information must be underpinned by the same high standards of ethical behavior that apply to audits of the financial statements. With that in mind, the IESBA developed the IESSA to mirror and to be equivalent to the standards that apply to the audit engagement, with certain but limited exceptions. And as you could see on the previous slide, and as Laura has explained, the IESSA is in a separate new part of the IESBA code in Part 5. This standalone approach makes it easier for those who are not familiar with the code yet to find all the provisions applicable to sustainability assurance engagement at the same place. Meanwhile, the new standard is still part of the code and demonstrates that the IESSA lies on the same robust ethical principles that the IESBA code represents. And as it was mentioned, the new standard is profession agnostic. The IESBA recognized that sustainability assurance engagement have been historically provided by assurance practitioners from all kinds of professions, for example, by engineers. And it is in the remit of the specific jurisdictions to determine who is allowed to provide sustainability assurance engagement. If the specific jurisdictions opens the market to all assurance providers, the IESSA is there, and it can be applied to all sustainability assurance practitioners who carry out the engagement irrespective of their profession. And the standards were developed in a way that is meant to be understood and applied by all practitioners, for example, by using neutral and sustainability-specific terms. By developing the standards, the IESBA put great emphasis on getting input from all kinds of sustainability assurance practitioners, not only from professional accountants. And as Laura mentioned, the IESBA also established a sustainability reference group that consists of practicing assurance practitioners outside of the accountancy profession. And that group provided input throughout the entire sustainability project as a sounding board. And finally, the standards are framework neutral, so that the ethics and independent standards can underpin any reporting or assurance framework used to prepare or assure the sustainability information, such as S1, S2, or the ISRS. Next slide, please. The IESSA consists of ethics and independent standards. The ethics standards provide the fundamental principles and set out the framework for expected behavior from sustainability assurance practitioners. The ethics standards apply to all sustainability assurance engagements, including limited and reasonable assurance engagements. Given the level of public reliance placed on sustainability disclosures, those performing the sustainability assurance engagement should follow stringent ethics requirements. However, adhering to high standards of ethical behavior only when performing sustainability assurance engagement for the client might not sufficiently safeguard stakeholders' confidence and public interest. For that reason, the IESBA believed that it would be important to hold the practitioner to the same high ethics standards with respect to any other professional services they might provide to the same client. Therefore, the ethics provision in IESSA apply not only to all sustainability assurance engagements, but any other professional services the sustainability assurance practitioner provides to the same client. However, with respect to the independent standards, the IESBA agreed to a proportionate approach. The board believed that requiring all sustainability assurance practitioners to comply with independence provisions equivalent to the standards for audit engagement would create too much burden for such practitioners, especially for smaller firms. Therefore, the independent standards in IESSA in Part 5 focus on sustainability assurance engagement with the same level of public interest as audits of the financial statements. And these are the sustainability assurance engagements where the sustainability information is developed in accordance with a general purpose framework, and the sustainability information is required by law regulation or otherwise publicly disclosed to support decision-making by investors or other users. This approach, by the way, is in line with the extant code that also provides different independent standards. In Part 4A, there are standards for audit and review engagements, and in Part 4B, standards for assurance engagements other than audit and review engagements. However, this approach doesn't mean that the IESBA code would not provide independence provisions in the context of sustainability of other sustainability assurance engagements, such as engagements where the information was developed in accordance with a special purpose framework or reports with restrictions on use. The independent standards in Part 4B that is already there and apply to assurance engagements other than audit and review engagement. It continues to apply for professional accountants when they perform these other sustainability assurance engagements. And the sustainability assurance practitioners who are not professional accountants are also encouraged to comply with the independent standards in Part 4B in that case. And going forward as a next step, the IESBA will consider developing profession-agnostic independent standards for these other sustainability assurance engagement as well as part of its next strategic and work plan. But during this webinar, we will provide you an overview of the key topics from both ethics and the independent standards in the IESSA. And I will pass to Laura to start with the ethics standards.
So let's focus on the ethics standards, like Szilvia just mentioned. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that the IESSA includes standards that guide sustainability assurance practitioners on how to deal with pressure from others that might result in a breach of compliance with the fundamental principles, such as the principle of integrity or objectivity or professional competence and due care. And the standards for dealing with pressure to behave unethically, these are not a new thing that the IESSA introduced. This is something that preceded the IESSA in the sense that it was already in the extant code of ethics issued by IESBA. And so the novelty introduced by the IESSA on this topic is new examples of pressure that are specifically related to sustainability assurance engagements. And notably, we're talking about examples of pressure to engage in greenwashing that is related to the sustainability assurance engagements. For example, pressure that is exerted on the practitioner to express an opinion on sustainability information that is prepared by the client and that is that opinion is not supported by the evidence obtained from the assurance procedures. Another example of pressure that is related to greenwashing in the context of a sustainability assurance engagement is pressure that is exerted on the practitioner to inappropriately alter the scope of the sustainability assurance engagement to influence how the client's sustainability goals or practices are perceived. So we can imagine these situations taking place where the pressure could be more or less overt, but the end result, if the practitioner succumbs to that pressure, would be for them to do the wrong thing and to paint a better picture or a greener picture, if you may, than what reality is. And so here we see clearly that greenwashing goes beyond the technical rules and cannot really be addressed by the reporting standards or the assurance standards. Greenwashing is a problem related to how these standards are applied, and the how is precisely where ethics comes in. So if we move to the next slide, please. I would like to talk a little bit about NOCLAR, which stands for non-compliance with laws and regulations. And so this slide that you have now on the screen, it covers the NOCLAR regime in IESSA, and therefore it applies to all sustainability assurance practitioners, regardless of whether they are professional accountants or non-professional accountants, and it also caters to the specificities of sustainability assurance engagements. And on the next slide, we'll be covering the regime or the changes made to the NOCLAR regime in the extant code, and that applies to professional accountants only. So let's focus on this slide now. What is NOCLAR in IESSA? Well, it's any act of omission or of commission that is intentional or unintentional, which is contrary to the prevailing laws or regulations, and that is committed by a sustainability assurance client or other entities in the client's orbit. And here we're talking about management, those charged with governance, employees, contractors of the client. The NOCLAR provisions in IESSA are, of course, subject to confidentiality duties and to the jurisdictional or the local rules. And so which laws and regulations are we talking about here? Well, the IESSA includes an illustrative list of laws and regulations that are covered by the NOCLAR regime. On the one hand, those laws and regulations that are specific to sustainability, for instance, environmental protection, protection of human rights, labor conditions. And on the other hand, we're also talking about laws and regulations related to the financial statements, for instance, money laundering or banking laws. And this is because assurance may be on integrated reporting that covers both financial and non-financial information. And who is the primary responsible for addressing a situation of non-compliance with laws and regulations? Well, here the answer is very simple. It's the client. And this means the management and those charged with governance of the sustainability assurance client. And this is because the assumption for the application of the NOCLAR regime is that the non-compliance was committed by people in the sphere of the client, and the situation affects the client's financial or non-financial information or its business in a material way. So it's very important to retain throughout the NOCLAR regime in IESSA and also in the extant code that the assurance practitioner is an additional line of defense in terms of NOCLAR, not the primary one. So what are the practitioner's responsibilities under the NOCLAR regime? Well, the first one is to, of course, obtain an understanding of the matter. Secondly, to address that matter with management and those charged with governance of the client. And also to communicate with certain third parties, again, as an additional line of defense, as I mentioned, and this includes, for instance, the auditor of the client's financial statements. So let's focus a little bit on this last part, the communication of NOCLAR between the sustainability assurance practitioner and the auditor. The IESBA believes that the audits of financial statements and certain sustainability assurance engagements, those that meet the conditions for the application of the independent standards in Part 5, as Szilvia mentioned, these two services have the same level of public interest. So there is an interest that the providers of audits and of those types of sustainability assurance engagements are aware of no-CLAR that is detected within the provision of such services. Therefore, the sustainability assurance practitioner under IESSA is required to communicate no-CLAR to the auditor if both practitioners belong to the same firm, or the sustainability assurance practitioner shall consider whether to communicate no-CLAR to the auditor of the financial statements if both practitioners are in the same network or if they belong to different firms or different networks. Naturally, both these requirements to communicate no-CLAR or to consider such communication are obviously subject to local laws and regulations, and notably those that relate to confidentiality duties. And what about no-CLAR that is committed in the value chain of the client? Well, as mentioned earlier, the no-CLAR regime in the IESSA applies only to non-compliance committed by a sustainability assurance client or other entities in the client's orbit, management, those charged with governance, employees, contractors. So therefore, practitioner is not required to apply the no-CLAR regime when the situation is committed in the client's value chain. However, it's important to note that this does not mean that the IESSA would support the practitioner to turn a blind eye to a situation of non-compliance in the value chain. Quite the contrary, the standards expressly recognize that the sustainability assurance practitioner might find the guidance on no-CLAR helpful when dealing with non-compliance in the value chain. So turning to the next slide, we have now the changes that were introduced to the extant code in the no-CLAR regime in the extant code, and therefore we're focusing on parts 2 and 3 of the IESBA code that apply to professional accountants. Part 2 applies to professional accountants in business, and we're talking about those working for an employing organization, and part 3 applies to professional accountants in public practice, so those that work in an accounting firm, notably as auditors of the financial statements. And why are we talking about the extant code and not the IESSA on this slide? Well, because some decisions that the IESBA made in the IESSA had implications for the extant code in parts 2 and 3. So the new provisions regarding the communication of no-CLAR by an accountant there are new provisions regarding the communication of no-CLAR by an accountant to a sustainability assurance practitioner that is performing the type of sustainability assurance engagements that have the same high level of public interest as an audit of the financial statements. So as we can see on the slide, it's those sustainability assurance engagements that meet the conditions for the application of the independent standards in part 5. So what does this mean for the the professional accountants in business and the professional accountants in public practice? So focusing on the first ones, the professional accountants in business, there is now a new requirement for senior professional accountants in business to determine whether to also disclose no-CLAR to the employing organization's sustainability assurance practitioner that is performing that type of sustainability assurance engagements. And why? Well, because the extant code already sets out a requirement for this senior professional accountant in business to consider communication of no-CLAR to the auditor. And again, since those types of sustainability assurance engagements have the same high level of public interest as an audit, then the IESBA understood that it was relevant to make the senior public professional accountant in business subject to an equivalent duty. And what about the professional accountants in public practice? Well, we have new requirements for the auditor to either communicate no-CLAR to the client's sustainability assurance practitioner that is performing that type of sustainability assurance engagement, if both belong to the same firm, and of course, unless this is prohibited by law or regulation, or the auditor should consider communicating no-CLAR to the client's sustainability assurance practitioner that is performing that type of sustainability assurance engagement if both are from the same network, or if they belong to different firms and networks. So as you can see, these new requirements for the accountants, for the auditors, they mirror those requirements that we spoke about in the previous slide for IESSA, for the Sustainability Assurance Practitioner. And this basically ensures that there is some reciprocity, some circularity of the no-CLAR communications between practitioners of services with the same level of public interest. And I will now hand it over to Szilvia to talk a little bit about the independent standards.
About the independent standards, that one of the key objectives of IESBA sustainability project was that the same robust ethics and independent standards need to underpin the assurance of sustainability information that currently apply to the audit of the financial statements. Therefore, the premise of IESBA work while developing the independent standards in Part 5 was that the relationships, interests, and circumstances that might create threats to independence in the context of an audit engagement might also create threats in the context of a sustainability assurance engagement. Accordingly, the independent standards in IESSA in Part 5 addresses the same areas that the independent standards in Part 4A applicable to audit engagements, such as financial relationships or business relationships with the client, previous employment with the client, or family and personal relationship, and so on. However, the independent standards in IESSA goes beyond that and recognizes that there are some threats related to the sustainability specific characteristics of the engagement, such as the different subject matter, namely the sustainability information, and the different reporting boundary, since the sustainability information includes informations from up and down the value chain. Therefore, the independent standards in Part 5, for example, includes definition of sustainability information and other sustainability-related terms. And you have already asked us in the chat box that what is the difference between the independent standards in Part 4A and Part 5. That the independent standards in Part 5 addresses, for example, the group sustainability assurance engagement and the value chain, and the independence considerations related to using the work of another practitioner, that is a sustainability specific concept. Or it also addresses provisions of sustainability related non-assurance services to the client, such as sustainability data and information services and advisory services on forward-looking information. And it deals with the issues arising when a firm performs both the audit and the sustainability assurance engagement, such as how to deal with fees from the same client or the long association with the client. And during this webinar, we will touch base on two matters, the group engagements and the independence considerations related to using the work of another practitioner. But during the deep dive webinar tomorrow on the independence standards, you can learn about all these topics in detail. Next slide, please. The group sustainability assurance engagement. The IESBA considered that sustainability reporting and assurance will focus mostly on entities that operate as groups, at least in the initial years when mandatory reporting and assurance become effective. In addition, certain sustainability reporting framework already require reporting of sustainability information on a consolidated basis. Therefore, the independent standards in IESSA expressly address the independence considerations applicable to such group engagement. And the IESBA and the IAASB closely coordinated on that matter, and the objective was to have the same approach to groups and include the same terms and definitions. In both standards, the group also includes different components. The IESSA and the ISSA 5000 differentiate between group components and value chain components. Group components are determined the same way as in the case of an audit engagement. These components are required to be included in the reporting entity's group financial statement. Meanwhile, a value chain component is a component within the reporting entity's value chain that is not included in the group financial statements. And the independence standards in IESSA provides independence considerations applicable when the group sustainability assurance firm is sufficiently and appropriately involved in the assurance work at the group. Therefore, there are provisions applicable to the group sustainability assurance firm, but the group firm might involve other practitioners, component practitioners, in whose work the group firm can be involved. And they are also subject to these independence requirements in the IESSA. And there are provisions for individuals, members of the group sustainability assurance team from any of these firms. The IESSA also sets out independence requirements when the group firm or a component practitioner performs assurance work at a group component or a value chain component for the purposes of the group engagement. Recognizing the different relationships of a group component and the value chain component with the reporting entity, the IESSA provides different independence provisions depending on whether or not the assurance work is performed at a group component or a value chain component. And it is important to emphasize that the IESSA does not require firms to be independent of the client's value chain. The requirement only focuses on value chain entities that are involved in the reporting boundary based on the applicable reporting framework. In addition to that, based on the applicable assurance standards, the firm determines to perform assurance work at the value chain component. So the focus is only on the value chain components at which assurance work is performed. And the standards provide detailed guidance on the meaning of performing assurance work and what activities this covers. And during the deep dive session tomorrow, we will provide you further details to the independence considerations applicable to group sustainability assurance engagements. Next slide, please. The IEESB standards, the ISSA 5000, the assurance standard, recognizes the concept that a firm might wish to use the work of another practitioner. And sometimes the firm cannot be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the work of these other practitioners who, in some instances, have already carried out the assurance work with respect to the group sustainability assurance client or the value chain component. So they are not component practitioners. In this regard, ISSA 5000 sets out the conditions for using the work of another practitioner for purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement. These conditions include that the firm needs to comply with the relevant ethical requirements, and the relevant ethical requirements are provided by the IESSA. Since the firm cannot be sufficiently and appropriately involved in the work of another practitioner, the premise of IESBA's approach was that the IESSA couldn't directly impose requirements on another practitioner who might not even be subject to the code and the IESSA. Therefore, the sustainability assurance practitioners remains ultimately responsible for the other practitioners' independence. And as you can see on the two boxes, or in the two boxes on the slides, the IESSA provides different requirements depending on whether the sustainability assurance practitioner uses the assurance work or other types of non-assurance work of that other practitioner. If the firm uses the assurance work, the independent standards in IESSA requires the firm, the sustainability assurance practitioner, to be satisfied that the other practitioner meets the independence requirements in IESSA with respect to that entity or component at which the assurance work is performed. And as you can see, the wording of this requirement, it is not required that the other practitioner confirm its independence in accordance with the IESSA. The other practitioner might be subject to other independent standards or professional standards, but these standards need to be at least as demanding as the IESSA if the firm would like to use that assurance work for the purposes of the engagement. And in the case of assurance work at a value chain component, the IESBA took a proportionate approach. And in that case, the sustainability assurance practitioner might comply with this requirement by reviewing the statement of the independence in the practitioner's report. If the firm uses the non-assurance work that you can see on the box in the right side, the IESBA considered that it would not be proportionate to require the firm to be satisfied about the other practitioners' independence in accordance with Part 5. Therefore, on balance, the IESBA developed guidance in the ethics standards of the IESSA that apply when the firm intends to use the non-assurance work of another practitioner. And the IESSA requires the sustainability assurance practitioner to exercise professional judgment to determine appropriate steps to fulfill his or her responsibility to comply with the fundamental principles when using the work of another practitioner. And this guidance includes specific examples of factors that the firm might consider when determining such steps, such as the reputation and the competence of that other practitioner, or whether that other practitioner is subject to applicable professional and ethics standards. Next slide, please. And finally, after all this information about the IESSA and the ethics and the independent standards, the question is that when will the standards become effective? In light of the close coordination and the interoperability, the IESBA and the IASB agreed to align the effective date of the IESSA and ISSA 5000. And the IESSA will be effective for assurance engagement on sustainability information for periods beginning on or after December 15, 2026, or as at a specific date on or after December 15, 2026. The early adoption of the standards is permitted and even encouraged by the IESBA. And the IESBA believes that this effective date will provide sufficient time for adoption and implementation of the new provisions. However, while developing the independence provisions for value chain component at which assurance work is performed, there were some concerns from stakeholders around the developing regulatory environment and the reporting landscape in relation to value chain and how the assurance practice might evolve. So responding to such concerns, the IESBA agreed to provide additional 18 months with respect to value chain components to support and facilitate market transition to the independence regime. And this extended period will enable the IESBA, in coordination with the IAASB, to monitor the evolution of the assurance practice with respect to the performance of assurance work at the value chain component, and consider the need for any response in the light of the developments. Accordingly, the IESBA determined to allow the option for a longer effective date, as I mentioned, for the provisions applicable to assurance work performed at a value chain component in sections 5405 and 5406 of the IESSA. And these provisions will be effective for sustainability assurance engagement on sustainability information for periods beginning on or after 1st of July 2028. However, if the sustainability assurance practitioner decides to use this deferred effective date, the sustainability assurance practitioner needs to meet a few conditions. For example, the group firm or a component practitioner still needs to apply the conceptual framework with respect to that work at a value chain component. Plus, the sustainability assurance practitioners needs to comply with transparency requirements regarding the use of the deferred effective date. But until the standards become effective in 2026, the IESBA is committed to providing further supporting material, such as FAQs and implementation guidance, to help the adoption and the implementation. And the IESBA will also collaborate and work closely with the regulators and the national standard setters in the specific jurisdiction to support the necessary capacity building for the adoption and the implementation. And with this, I finish our presentation, and I will turn to Geoff to see if there is any question we have received.
Thank you, Laura and Szilvia, for the informative presentation. So we do have some time for questions. And if you do have some questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box now. So perhaps one might start with you, Laura. And this is a question on NOCLA. Involves a situation when there are two sustainability assurance practitioners. So if an entity engages two separate sustainability assurance practitioners, one to provide assurance on the entity's environmental footprint, and another to provide assurance on labor conditions provided by companies within that particular entity's value chain. And one of the practitioners then encounters a situation of NOCLA. Does that practitioner that has encountered the NOCLA situation, or have encountered NOCLA, need to inform the other sustainability assurance practitioners under IESSA? Thanks, Laura.
Sure. Thanks, Geoff. That's an interesting question, and I have a short answer and a long answer for that. The short answer is there is no such requirement in IESSA for one sustainability assurance practitioner to inform the other sustainability assurance practitioner of a situation of non-compliance with laws and regulations. However, the long answer is the IESBA considered this possibility at length, and this was also discussed with the sustainability reference group, with that group of practitioners and experts. And the IESBA also considered the feedback from respondents to the exposure draft who raised this specific topic, actually. And after all of this, the IESBA concluded that this scenario is actually not that common, and maybe more so at the current moment, while businesses are adjusting to an increase in sustainability disclosures and assurance thereon. And we also anticipate that this industry in the future will involve fewer assurance practitioners, in the sense that as we see the growth of integrated reporting, and so the consequences of integrated reporting at the assurance level is most likely having just one provider assuring the financial and the non-financial information. And in addition, the IESBA was also very aware of the compliance costs that resulted from IESSA, especially for a group of practitioners that are not necessarily familiar with the IESBA code, and I'm talking here about the non-professional accountants. And so, with all things considered, the IESBA agreed to adopt a phased approach here. And this means not setting out requirements for sustainability assurance practitioners to communicate NOCLA with each other, but instead to go through another way, which is to remind the management and those charged with governance of the client that the communication of NOCLAR to relevant third parties is indeed an obligation that primarily belongs to the entity, to the client, and it should not be just outsourced to its service providers. So this topic of communication of NOCLAR between sustainability assurance practitioners when there is more than one, this was addressed in IESSA via a provision that sets out that the sustainability assurance practitioner needs to discuss the situation of NOCLAR with management and those charged with governance. And then within that context, they will discuss which third parties need to be informed. And of course, that includes other sustainability assurance practitioners, if there are more than one, the auditor of the financial statements, etc. So in summary, just to sum all this information up, the IESSA does not require a sustainability assurance practitioner to communicate NOCLAR to another sustainability assurance practitioner, but that communication clearly belongs to the client, to management, to those charged with governance. And this way, we avoid a communication loophole when there is more than one sustainability assurance practitioner. And I hope this answers the question.
Great, thank you, Laura, for that. Next, I have a question on the provision of non-assurance services. So we'll pass that one to Szilvia in relation to sustainability data under Part 5 of IESA. The question is, the party who performs sustainability assurance work may have independence issues if they also perform sustainability related non-assurance services for the same client?
Thank you, Geoff. So I assume from the question that we are talking about the sustainability data and information services,
Yes.
specific
Yes.
services in that regard. And the response is, yeah, the IESSA addresses the sustainability data and information services because if the practitioner has previously participated in preparing of the sustainability information, and now the practitioner is providing assurance on the same information, that create a self-review situation that compromise the practitioner's independence. So in that sense, my response is yes, that's an independence issue. And the code provides detailed guidance for public interest entities when the client is a public interest entity and also when it is not a public interest entity. And it explains the impact of the sustainability, the provision of the sustainability data and information services on the sustainability information on which the practitioner issues an opinion. So that's another important element that we are focusing on the impact of these services on the information on which the firm expresses an opinion. So for example, this is another difference to Part 4A when, for example, accounting and bookkeeping services and the impact on the financial statement. The financial statements is a whole, an entirety. So the audit includes the audit of the entire financial statement. While in the case of sustainability information, there might be practitioners who is providing assurance on the greenhouse gas effects, the others on the DEI. So the guidance in the code is really focuses on the impact of the services or the sustainability information that is subject to the sustainability assurance engagement. So it's true, again, same as Laura, it's hard to give a short response and a yes or no response because, again, the code is a principle-based code. So there is not a list of prohibited services. It is really providing the approach how to identify the threats and, if possible, how to address or eliminate these threats with safeguards.
Okay. Thank you, Szilvia, for that. Next, we have a question on NOCLA, and we actually received a similar question yesterday from one of the participants as well. So the question, this one is for Laura. If the engagement contract of the sustainability assurance practitioner has a confidential provision, can the practitioner still whistleblow a NOCLA breach to a regulator?
Thanks, Geoff. So one thing that I would like to underline regarding the NOCLA regime in the IESBA code is that this regime is always subject to local laws and regulations. Of course, as is the same situation for the rest of the code, but in terms of NOCLA, we're dealing about breach of local laws and regulations, and the way to deal with it, the regime in the code is of course subject to limitations that we have in jurisdictions. And when we think about those potential limitations, there is of course confidential duties. And these confidential duties can come from professional standards or contractual provisions, such as, like the question mentions, the employment contract. And so it's very important to be aware of like I said, the limitations that are set out in the local laws and regulations or in the local contracts, the provisions that apply to the sustainability assurance practitioner in particular in a certain jurisdiction, to analyze what in the NOCLA regime in the IESBA code can be complied as is or needs to be adjusted to the local specificities. So I would say there is no one-size-fits-all answer for this question. It really needs to be ascertained in light of the local provisions. And since the question specifically mentions an employment contract, it's also important to analyze whether the provisions of that employment contract, they are according to the local laws. So if they are and if they prohibit any kind of disclosure, then that must be complied with. Even though, again, the question also mentions whistleblowing, and usually those types of channels and mechanisms, they are protected by the laws, and they are exempted from confidentiality duties because they tend to be anonymous. Yeah, so that's my answer.
Thank you, Laura, for that. And we do get a few NOCLA questions from time to time from our stakeholders, of course. Next, we have probably time just for one more question. So I have another question for Szilvia, and we do get also this type of questions quite often from stakeholders. So this is in relation to voluntary reporting. So the question is, there are still some jurisdictions where the local laws and regulations do not yet require sustainability reporting, but some reporting entities might choose to disclose their sustainability information and obtain assurance reports there on a, of course, voluntary basis. So does that mean that these voluntary reports are not within the scope of the International Independent Standards, IIS, in Part 5? Szilvia.
Yeah, you're right, Geoff. We get that question quite often, and so as I mentioned, the scope of or the International Independent Standards in Part 5 focuses on sustainability assurance engagement on sustainability information that was developed in accordance with a general purpose framework, and the national laws and regulation require the sustainability information, or the sustainability information was otherwise publicly disclosed to support the decision making of investors. And the last part is the important part, that it's really explains that it's not only focusing on the mandatory reporting, but also if there is a voluntary reporting and the sustainability information was developed in accordance with the general purpose framework. So the short answer is yes, they are part of the scope of the part 5, and simply because the IESSA didn't want to differentiate the applicable independence requirements in the specific jurisdiction based on their approach to sustainability reporting or their development in the field of sustainability reporting.
Thank you, Szilvia. So we have come to the end of our session. It's right on the dot, the hour. So thank you again, Szilvia and Laura, for your excellent presentation, and I hope that for everyone, you got a lot out of that discussion. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar and also the slide deck will be available on our website towards the end of the week. If you like to access this or any other support material that we have on our sustainability standards, please feel free to visit our website, and throughout the next few months, we will be providing more supporting material. I would also like to take this opportunity to remind you that we do have one more webinar this week, tomorrow between 7 to 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And during that session, we will be holding a deep dive discussion on the international independence standards in the IESSA. So it's still not too late to register. So if you would like to learn more about the independence components of IESSA. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day, and bye for now. Thank you.